Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. What I will be presenting is very different from what Barbara's just been presenting. Our contexts are, I think, worlds apart. But also, I think this is more of an impact evaluation rather than a program evaluation. So I think it is interesting to see both sides in one session. So just general context first. This is a multi-party collaborative project that Bookdash was part of. It's called Yizani Sifunde, which is a Xhosa word or Xhosa term, which means come, let's read. So it was a project that was run in the Eastern Cape, which is a province in South Africa. We have 9 provinces. The Eastern Cape is quite rural. It's very poor, very under-resourced and very underserved. And in terms of educational outcomes, as measured higher up in our system, at the 4th grade, etc., they are usually one of the provinces that does the worst, really. They lag behind because of under-resourcing, poverty, difficult social circumstances. So the title of our evaluation really was Getting Children on Track in the Eastern Cape. And it's an evaluation of the impact of this collaborative project. So our collaborators in the project, I would like to give a little bit of feedback about. Bookdash, firstly, for those of you who don't know, we're a non-profit organization based in South Africa. We're primarily a publishing organization, but we're interested in the social impact of distributing books to children who would never otherwise own books. We do not access any government funding whatsoever. So we are completely funded by through local and international trusts and foundations, individual donors, and corporate social responsibility donations. So our role in the project, and I will show you some kind of graphic representations of the different project roles, but we provided books in this project. On the left of our logo is the logo of Nali Bali. They are also a non-profit, also do not access government funding, and they are a reading promotion organization. So their role is to ignite interest in reading, to get children enthusiastic and get families enthusiastic about reading. They operate nationally, as do we. WordWorks, their logo to the right of ours, they are a resource and training organization. So they train early learning practitioners. I'm afraid there might be quite a few abbreviations and acronyms in my presentation. I'll try and explain as I go along, but if I forget, please ask a question in the chat, because my colleague Julia will be able to respond to anything that's easy to respond to. She can also respond to difficult things, but what I mean is on the go. She can give you just an explanation of what I mean. I'm afraid it's probably riddled with abbreviations. So WordWorks trains the early learning practitioners, the early childhood development, the ECD practitioners. And they specialize in training them on how to stimulate emergent literacy. So this whole project was focused on 45-year-old children in 2 areas in the Eastern Cape. And perhaps I can just go down actually to my next slide. I wanted to show you that there was a link, which we will also put in the chat later on if you wanted to download the full evaluation report, as well as summary infographics that summarize the findings and the insights from the evaluation. So these are just photographs of the project, of the beneficiaries in the project. So it's children who are in ECD, Early Childhood Development Centers in the Eastern Cape. And on the left, you can see a very young child who is a sibling, and also therefore an indirect beneficiary of the books. I wanted to just briefly talk, before we talk about the rest of the project, I've spoken on the right-hand side here. You see again the 3 different project partners. The organization, or this project was funded by a corporate funder in South Africa, the Liberty Community Trust, And they identified synergies between the three organizations and then asked us to put together a joint proposal to improve early learning outcomes in the Eastern Cape. That was the basic brief. And so each of us has something really specific that we contributed to help get to this outcome, but also in our collaboration, each project partner had a specific role. Nalibali, for instance, recruited and managed the field staff. Those were the young people who sparked interest in reading and did the reading promotion. And they also led on our communications around this project. WordWorks, who are the teacher training experts, they also took the lead on the monitoring and evaluation for the full project. So they collated and analyzed the data. They led reflection, which was a very important aspect of our project, and they oversaw the external evaluation. So it was a completely different agency that did the evaluation. As Booktash, we chaired this partnership, which meant that we took the lead in terms of meetings, the admin, the funder communications, the kind of liaison with our donors, and also the knowledge management of this collaboration. And I wanted to also just show you the timelines to give you an overview of how it worked. So in 2019, we did the proposal and we did the first project design. 2020 was a planning year. Initially, we had planned to start implementation in 2020, but of course, COVID's struck the world and we really couldn't implement because children were not in ECD centers. There was very low attendance. Children were mostly kept at home for most of 2020. So that gave us an opportunity to detail our partnership agreements, do an internal memorandum of understanding to govern our relationships, and then do very detailed project design, logic frameworks, etc. We then implemented in 2021 for the first year with one cohort of children and their ECD practitioners and those families and those communities. We piloted the system. We learned a lot. At the end of year one, there was quite a specific and explicit learning and reflection phase, which led to an improved model for the year two implementation, which was a different cohort of children and ECD practitioners and communities and families. And then in year three, which was last year, it was the third year of implementation, the third cohort of beneficiaries, and the external evaluation was also done. I'll talk a lot about the external evaluation so that you can understand what was evaluated and how they did it. And then this year, we've been doing a wrap-up really to close off the project, to conclude the evaluation, to document the lessons that we've learned, and to disseminate the findings that can hopefully be of interest to other people working broadly in the field of literacy, in terms and in the field of early learning and early childhood outcomes. So the project worked like this. It was a collaborative project. As I've said, the children were aged 4 to 5, and it was implemented in 3 one-year cycles in the Eastern Cape. We called it a triple cocktail of inputs, and that's along the kind of vertical axis here. The 3 inputs were resources, training, and then support and modeling. And then there were 3 beneficiary domains. So these inputs went into 3 different domains. The one was the ECD centers, the pre-primary schools. The one was the homes, and the one was the community. So it had these 3 different domains that the project reached. In terms of inputs, where the book-books came in was in the ECD centers and also in the homes. So each child in each of the cohorts received a minimum of 25 books, or was supposed to. These books were all in the home language, so they were in isiXhosa. There were a few in English and 1 or 2 wordless books as well, but 80% were in the child's home language. They could receive as many as 50 books in a year if they also attended reading clubs that were part of the community domain. The teachers received training. So if you go back to the ECD centers, that pillar, they received really good WordWorks training. to implement the program called Little Stars. That was the program that was implemented. They also facilitated parent workshops. So in other words, the parents of the children in the ECD centers were called to the centers. They were given training on how to read with your child, why you read with your child, what the purpose is, etc. And then also in the ECD centers, you had these young people employed by Nali Bali, who were the story sparkers, who came to each ECD center once a week and modeled very engaging story time reading with the children. And so the ECD practitioners, the teachers, observed this and learned from seeing how engaged the children are. The story sparkers, you know, they get the children to play games around the story, they act out the story, they sing songs around the story. It's really best practice in terms of how you can ignite and activate early learning using a story and a book as the spark. All right, I think I'll go to the next slide, which is just an overview of the reach. So over 3 years, in the totality of the 3 years of implementation, there were 1,200 children in reading clubs that were reached. And these were reading clubs that were run in the afternoon after school, reaching children that were not in the ECD centers. It was often siblings and slightly older children. There were 3,000 children in the project classrooms that were reached. So it was about 1,000 children per year. And 126 ECD centers in the Eastern Cape were reached. So these means that there were also, if you look a little bit further along, 126 teachers were trained. So 7,600 community members were reached through activations, and that would be where the story sparkers would go to a clinic, for instance, and talk to the parents while they're waiting, give them books, show them how to read. So there was a kind of a community aspect to that as well. 500 and more parents and caregivers were reached through parent workshops at the ECD centers. We say parents and caregivers because I think more than half of the children are cared for by their grandmothers, not by their parents. So the families look a little bit different from what we would expect in terms of a nuclear family. During the course of the 3 years, we distributed almost 240,000 books, so that's a lot of books, and about 84,000 reading supplements that were also created by Nali Bali that contained more stories that were given out to children in the reading clubs. So that gives you an idea of the kind of scope. So to tell you a little bit about the project evaluation for those of you who might be interested in the kind of methodology, but I'll skip over it. And if you have any very technical questions, I will have to take them in writing and refer them back to our researchers because I can just report on the headlines. So in the 3rd year of implementation, we had this external agency come in to evaluate the impact of the project on young children. So they were called Social Impact Insights Africa. Their logo is there at the top right. And what they did was our school year in South Africa runs from January to November. And so the baseline assessments were done in February last year, so that at the start of the school year. And the end line with the same sample of children was done in October last year after 8 months of project activity towards the end of the school year. The data that was gathered was at the ECDs. They surveyed the center managers, they observed the infrastructures, and they got some basic child statistics, both at baseline and at end line to compare. And then they assessed the children using a tool called the ELOM tool. It's an abbreviation for Early Learning Outcomes Measure. And it's a very reputable and trustworthy tool used in South Africa. It's normed for South Africa and it's standardized in South Africa. It also provides early learning benchmarks per province. So it's normed per province, which is very useful because there are lots of variation between provinces in terms of socioeconomic level and poverty, etc. So the children were assessed at baseline in 3 domains. It's called 3 early learning domains. The one is fine motor coordination and visual integration. That's a very important skill, obviously, to ensure that a child is ready for learning when they enter formal schooling. So the fine motor coordination has to do with cutting, with drawing, with coloring in, with all the fine motor skills that should be in place. The second domain was cognition and executive functioning. Those have to do that. Those are the skills the learning skills that you need in order to be able to learn. So it's like, can you focus? Can you concentrate? Can you sit still? Can you sequence? So it has more to do with the kind of cognitive skills. And then emergent literacy and language. And so that has to do, obviously, with vocabulary, with words, with sentences, with recognition of concepts, etc. They also included, from a slightly older age group, 2 other items. The one was around productive vocabulary, so how many words can the child say, as opposed to how many words can a child recognize. And then specifically interesting for us is book orientation and word concept, which was also included. They also did a physical assessment of the children in terms of their growth to determine which of the children were stunted. We have a very big stunting problem in South Africa, which means reduced growth, and that is because of not inadequate nutrition. And if a child is stunted physically, there are lots of complications and challenges in terms of learning, obviously. So that was an important variable to establish at the beginning. Then at the end of the assessment, well, the endline assessment assessed exactly the same. They did add one element, which is interesting, and that is that they added the emergent numeracy and mathematics. But that wasn't assessed at baseline, but they added that in because there had been indications that there were interesting things happening around emergent numeracy and mathematics. So here are the findings. What was the impact on the children? So the finding was that the project was effective and holistic, and that children's literacy and other skills improved significantly. So before we go on, this is just a recap. 99 children were assessed in February and October, and the 4 domains at the bottom were the domains that were assessed. Right. Then very important for this graph is the color coding at the bottom. On track is green, and that is an indicator to say that this child is on track to be able to enter formal schooling and cope well. Falling behind is what it says. This child is not quite ready. Falling far behind means that there are significant challenges to this child, or there will be, if there isn't an intervention for them. They will not cope when they enter formal schooling. They are going to fall further and further behind. That's the prediction. So after 8 months of intervention in this project, the literacy and language domain. So let's just focus on this one domain first. The first bar, which is a little bit more faint than the rest, indicates the Eastern Cape average, the benchmark. So this is what the ELOM tool provided us with, right? It showed that 49% of the children in the Eastern Cape were on track. So this is the benchmark against which one can measure. 20% of the children in the Eastern Cape were falling far behind. Our cohort of children at the baseline, only 29% of them were on track, while 25% of them were falling far behind. So it indicates that our children came from even more difficult circumstances than the average Eastern Cape. But at endline, 57% of the children in our study, in our project, were on track, and only 13% of them were falling far behind. So very like ballpark speaking, the number of children that were on track doubled, and the number of children that were falling far behind halved. And then a similar pattern can be seen across the other 3 domains as well: the fine motor skills, the executive functioning, and the numeracy. So what's interesting is that because of the halo effect of this intervention, the numeracy, which we didn't measure at baseline, but you can look at the Eastern Cape benchmark, only 28% of children were on track for their numeracy in the Eastern Cape. At Endline, 61% of our children were on track and only 14% were falling behind. So even though this was a literacy program, it was holistic in that it had a spillover effect onto other domains that are really important for children to be able to cope and operate in their later schooling. So another finding was that the project was progressive, with struggling children improving the most. So in any of these projects, you looked at what the maturation effect would be. In other words, what would a child learn in the span of 8 months at this age, in any case, whether they are in any kind of program or not. At this age, we all know they develop very quickly, they learn lots of things. So there are statistical ways to, and formulas that you kind of calculate this out. So you take out the normal maturation effect, and then you look at what is the effect of the program in terms of extra learning that the child had done. And so what we found was that for all children, they learned up to they had up to 6 months additional learning to what they would have learned in an 8-month period in any case. And that the children who were most at risk, the ones that were falling far behind at the beginning, they gained the most, up to 13 months in the different domains. And in a context like the Eastern Cape that I showed you, where so many children were falling far behind, this was particularly encouraging, is the fact that an 8-month intervention can actually give so much additional learning to the children. Then something that for us at Bookdash is really very important is what has shifted in the homes, because our vision is that every child must own 100 books by the age of 5. So for us, we're very, very conscious of the fact that the home is the first educational setting for children. It's, you know, we all know why it's so important to have books in the home. I'm definitely preaching to the choir if I go on any more about that. But it was really good for us to see what the abundant book the ownership that we put into this project, what the results were. And what the results were was that it increased reading at home, and parent workshops increased other positive parenting practices as well. So the project radically increased book ownership. At the beginning, there were 1.6 books on average in the homes, and by the end, it was 26.4. We also know that 78% of the children shared their books with siblings and neighbors. So the effect was much bigger than just the children who received the books. Caregivers read with the children more often, whether or not they attended workshops. So you can see the number of caregivers who said that they read 3 or more times per week increased quite drastically from the beginning to the end. And the percentage of caregivers who never read with their children dropped to virtually nothing. And so for us, that is also really encouraging. By having books in the home, there was more reading happening. Because we were often, we often asked, yes, you send books home, but how do you need that? How do you know that parents read? How do you know that there's interaction around the books? How do you know this? And now we know this. And this was based on 352 caregiver interviews that were conducted at baseline and endline. So it's a substantial number, and I think we can safely make the claim. Caregivers who attended the workshops, and this is also important, they told more stories and drew more often with children. And those two activities are also really important in terms of early learning and early literacy. And then the reading clubs extended the reach of the project. So just to give you, again, a face to what we've just said, this little boy is called Apendule, the one second from the right. He received, I think he got 35 books in the project. And these are his 4 siblings. And they all shared his books. And there was a lot of very positive interaction around books and reading in that home. He can't yet read. He's preschool, but his siblings read to him. They also read the books independently, and they also read the books to each other. So then when we isolated out the role of books through a regression analysis, it was found that children with more books at home, so all the children received some books, but some children received a lot more. because they attended more events, because their attendance at the preschool was more regular. So children with more books at home had even better overall ELOM scores than those with fewer books. Their executive functioning and their early numeracy were also better or scored higher than those with fewer books at home. So it doesn't mean that book ownership is more effective than the other elements of the project, but it does mean that you can isolate it as one of the things that made a real difference. And then what we were also very interested in is how did the shifts in caregiver attitude and behavior happen. And so the researchers called it the nudge effect, which is where the children in the ECD centers were nudged by their teachers, the story sparkers. Those were the young people who went in and read with them, and their teachers, the ECD practitioners, regularly asked the children if they were reading at home. The children then went home and they enthusiastically pressured their caregivers to read with them. And they could, because they had books. And this led to what they called the joy and pride effect, where the caregivers felt excited and happy and proud to see their children's skills and intelligence. Many of the caregivers said to us, I didn't know that my child could understand a book at this age. I didn't know that my child was so clever and could talk about the pictures. So they felt very proud, and they had this moments of shared joy and pleasure, which we know are so, so important. And that led to the caregivers and the children reading together more regularly. So this, I think, is my favorite graphic from the whole evaluation, because that's exactly what we know can happen if there are enough books in a household. And now, as Book Dash, we have a local case study in South Africa, and not just the international literature. And we can refer our sponsors, our donors, anyone who's interested or might be a little bit skeptical about sending books home with children, that this actually has this effect, and also that it's manifested into those very encouraging early learning outcomes for the children. And that's the end of my prepared presentation. And I think we can perhaps go to questions.